So at this point, we've gone through the entirety of the Standard Behavioral Index, and what we can do now is just review everything once again. Now that we have everything defined, we have everything labeled, we'll just go through and look at all the standard side of things, just kind of as a wrap-up. Brought up when we had sort of the chart table version of the index, and it deals with the interaction between men and women when a male may be using any other faculty and a woman is stuck in the B scale. And there's a problem that happens at this factor and at this factor. So there are 4 complexities. There's a problem called fourth answer. And then here, there's a problem called 10th answer. And if you think of the other faculties, if you think about communicating in horizontal thinking and in orthogonal thinking, one of the things that's going on is that you're exchanging information and you're comparing what's being said. And men don't necessarily have to deal with this amount of complexity. For the most part, they're going to be limited to compulsive impulse, which is like 3 or 4 different complexities at their sort of limit. But women can use any of these so long as they're able. And what will happen is that in the dynamic between men and women communicating, if a woman is somewhere here in the scale, the male may only be able to provide a specific magnitude of information, while the woman is considering a bunch of additional things. She has all these different patterns and complexities that she's comparing, while the male is more likely going just to be considering his thought processes and so on. And that can lead to some friction between them because men can be more dominant. They could seem to be the leader sometime, and they want their opinions heard. They want to communicate what they're going through. And women can be somewhere on the scale considering way more information, and they can come off as maybe dismissive or sort of dance around what the male is trying to communicate, and that can lead to some sort of friction between them. And what will happen is that men will try to provide additional information, sometimes to the point of nonsense, sometimes to the point of violence, or kind of throwing somebody else under the bus, and that becomes a dynamic that they present to women. They kind of have their complete consideration, and they take it a step further in order to get the attention of the woman. And the same thing happens at 10th answer, and the difference is that you do that sort of throwing somebody under the bus process, or that sort of taking things a step further process several times over. You do that maybe 3 or 4 different times, and you essentially try to get some kind of mismatch to catch the woman's attention so that they participate and reciprocate the communication. So there are a few consequences to the women utilizing the V scale and having to be forced into that mind frame, especially when it comes to communicating with men. And if men are not aware of this, then there's a chance that they just kind of push the issue, and that just kind of becomes their coping mechanism when it comes to communicating with women. So it is worth mentioning that there is a specific dynamic that happens between what men are capable of recognizing and the patterns that they can solve based on their hormones and all that stuff versus what women are able to do. And those are the 2 main places it seems to happen. That's something that could have other phenomenon that standard theory just doesn't really recognize, but those seem to be the places where it happens more often than not, is at 4th answer and at 10th answer. So that's just an additional phenomenon to consider when it comes to the B scale. This sort of visualization of it separately from all the patterns and numbers and stuff being written in there and all that. So there's the 0 factor, 1st factor, 2nd factor, 3rd factor, 4th factor, and 5th factor, and the complexities of each. And that's essentially how complex communication is organized, or how the V scale is organized. Okay, now we'll get back to the behavioral index and just go over the entire thing. We've presented all of the aspects of the standard behavioral index, so just go through that one more time. Okay, so here's the Standard Behavioral Index. We have the Z0 scale, which is what defines our unit. Those units are defined by the components of impulse. We have we have impulse, we have subtraction, and then we have compression. Those are the components of impulse. We add those three components together and we get one cycle of communication, which is defined by the amount of information within each cycle, which is congruent to one subtraction. And once we have enough of these, and once all the conditions are met, which is sort of the slanted line here that represents all the different things that have to happen in terms of being in a safe environment and being at the right physical status and all that stuff. Once that happens, we can unlock the potential to get into the R scale, or the scale of intelligence. And from there, we can go through the different thinking types, which are horizontal thinking, orthogonal thinking, and absolute thinking. Within each thinking type, there are communication types, which are silent, intimate, social. And the next thinking type over, we have shared. And then the next thinking type over, we have super social. So within each one of those, we have the individual characteristics, first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, ninth, eighth, seventh. We have the range from 10 to 17. And then we have the different stepping stones, the cycle characteristics from 25, 27, 54, and 117. Then we hit the gap. And once we hit the gap, we're forced into post-intelligent impulse on the Z scale. Everything in the R scale is compressed and transmuted over. We have these ranges that we can use to solve the problems we need to. And then there's also the capacity for rolling communication, and then also complex communication, and on into the V scale. And that's it. We go back around. We start by doing some identifying process. We either get back to resting, or we have some kind of body status change. There's something that sort of resets us, and from there we start over again. We start with the Z scale. We access the capacity for intelligence. We go through that, we hit the gap, and we go to post-intelligence, and then kind of back around again. So that's sort of the general tendency for people to go through their mentation and their thought processes in a standard, congruent, normalized kind of way. And that's our definition of what normal is. That's the definition of normal mentation, and that's what the Standard Behavioral Index organizes. So we can go back through and just say this is the Z scale, this is the second characteristic, this is negative 185 characteristics, this is 117 characteristics, this is the gap. And anytime we observe something, we can just point and say what that person's going through best matches this specific characteristic. So the same way you can learn to recognize a symptom, or you can kind of read someone's mood, or something like that, you can determine what they're going through based on which characteristic matches the best. And that's what the Behavioral Index allows us to do. That's what standard theory explains. And that's the set of rules that we use to determine what a person's going through. So the other thing that you can do with the Behavioral Index is look at what happens when you have something that is incongruent. You have something that is not symmetric. You have something that happens differently than what the normal process is. It looks exactly the same. The only thing is that the definition for each one of them is going to change. So instead of saying the first characteristic of communication, we would refer to abnormal process. And what we can do next is talk about each one of those, starting from the Z0 scale, going into the R scale, and then finally what happens in the Z scale in the abnormal sense. And the other sort of thing is that there is actually a additional scale, additional abnormal scale that is involved with intelligence, and that's the true scale of intelligent derangement. But all of that is part of the non-standard behavioral index, which is what we can talk about next. At this point, we talked about all the standard stuff, so now we're going to start talking about the non-standard stuff and what happens when things go wrong. Things are much more likely to go wrong in real life with everyday, day in, day out kind of stuff things are much more likely to go wrong, and that can make the standard behavioral index very difficult to relate to, because you think of maybe 1 in 100 times where that actually happens. What you're more likely to see is the abnormal stuff, and that's nobody's fault. It's really a collective of all kinds of different factors, but what you may resonate much more with or be much more familiar with or see in just your day in, day out kind of things are the non-standard sorts of processes. So we'll go ahead and start with the non-standard version of the Z-naught scale. And the Z-naught scale on its own is very simple. It's just the components of impulse, and those are impulse, subtraction, and compression. Impulse, subtraction, and compression. So in a non-standard way, all we look at is what happens when this is interrupted. And each one of these things has their own associated problems. So if you think back to the Z-naught scale in the standard sense, each one of these has their own magnitude. So impulse happens at a ratio of about 1/2 units, subtraction happens at 3/2 units, and compression happens at about -1/2 units. So we're going to start with impulse and talk about what can happen when impulse goes wrong. So the first thing that can happen is that there's too much impulse. There can be an increase in impulse. So there can be too much going on. Impulse is way more than it should. Instead of happening at 1/2 unit, even a change to from 1/2 to 4/5, let's say, from 0.5 to 0.8, that could make a huge difference in the amount of subtraction that we see. So instead of, let's just consider that. This may not be exactly correct, but just a way to kind of think about it. Let's say that our impulse now, for whatever reason, is at 0.8. And the ratio from impulse to subtraction in the standard sense is going to give us about 3 times as much. So now our subtraction, instead of being 1.5, has jumped to 2.4. So now, what's going to happen with our compression, we have to alter that in some way. If we only compress what the brain is capable of doing on its own, it's going to be an inverse of the normal impulse. But if this impulse is beyond what the brain is normally able to do, our compression is still only going to be about 0.5. So if we multiply that by 3, 1.5, now all of a sudden we're left with about 0.9 units that are unresolved. So now there's a whole bunch of information that we experienced, but now we can't make meaning of it. We can't do anything with it. So if we increase our impulse, what we're dealing with is a bunch of unresolved information. There's a bunch of extra stuff left on the table that we're not able to really solve or handle. So just by altering the impulse a little bit, already we're running into a bunch of problems. So the other thing that can happen is that we can decrease our impulse. We can have an impulse that's maybe 1/4, let's say about 0.25. And let's say that we continue that pattern, we have about 3 times as much. So now we have 0.75 units of information and subtraction. And then let's say that we still have our normal compression ratio at about -1/2. So if we subtract that from here, all of a sudden there is a disparity in the information that we're making meaning of. Now there's blank space. It's not that there's too much information, now there's blank space in what we've compressed. So we run into a problem there as well. So if the impulse is altered even a little bit, now we have problems with the amount of information we're comparing. It's an irregular amount of information. And now we have to alter what is being stored in the brain. Either we're going to have extra information or we're going to have missing information. And every time that happens, you're going to have an irregular amount of information. So if you start with everything being standard, you have compression after compression after compression after compression, and each one of those are going to be the same. They're going to be 3/2 units. 3/2, or if you want to think of them as 1.5. But if you have these different impulses going on, whether that be from medication, from drugs, from alcohol, cigarettes, from salts, food additives, anything. Now, instead of them all being normal, now you have one, your compression has an additional 0.9 here, you have another one here that's additional 0.9, which is going to be extra information, and then on top of that, you can have some that are missing information that sort of have some gaps in there. So now you have all kinds of different unresolved processes. They have different magnitudes. The brain has to read them differently, and all kinds of stuff. But that's essentially what can happen in impulse, just if you alter the impulse. So now we can think about what happens when we alter the subtraction. And one thing that can happen is that impulse can happen without there being an external cue. You can have a medication or something like that, and for whatever reason, there's no information in the environment. Now, whenever you have a subtraction, that subtraction is just zero. There's nothing there. And you think of trying to compress information that's not happening at the same ratio. Now you have a lack of 1.5 units. So now, instead of having a dot, or instead of having something in there, whenever that subtraction is altered, now you just have a blank. There's just kind of a blank space. The other thing that can happen is that the subtraction continues. So maybe you have a normal impulse, and maybe you start the subtraction, but for whatever reason it doesn't get to the point where you resolve that amount of information. It just continues, and it just keeps going. Now you have basically, we can think of as kind of like an infinite amount of subtraction, and all you have is a repeated amount of compression, which is 0.5, 0.5, 0.5, 0.5, 0.5, but you never get to the point where the information is actually stored. All you're doing is just constantly comparing information. So that's another problem you can get with altering the subtraction. So the other thing that can happen is you can alter the compression. So if you try altering the compression, instead of, even if everything else goes normal, instead of it being at a ratio of 0.5, maybe it's a ratio of 0.8, you end up with an additional negative amount of information. So the same way there's, maybe some of it is there, but you compress more than what you need. There's sort of a really wide frame, but only part of it is filled with information, so you end up with a partial blank there. So anytime that happens, what you're dealing with is an abnormal amount of terminal status. At the very end of things, when this is being stored within the structure of the brain, it's going to be something that's different than what the standard should be. And those are kind of the different reasons that it could change. It could change because of medication. It could change because of the amount of information that's available to you. It could be something that happens internally versus externally. And the idea of compression is essentially that you're reversing the impulse that began whatever started that thing. So the way to try to address that is trying to find something that will allow you to reverse that, which the only thing that can do that are medications or adulterants or external things. It's very hard to think that the brain is going to be able to change what it's supposed to be doing without some kind of intervention. So while it is difficult to alter the compression to match the impulse of subtraction, if somehow we find a way to measure this and we realize that somebody has some kind of problem through an imbalance or something, the whole purpose of using a medication or something to intervene in this is to get these to match what the brain does in its most natural state as best as possible. But once we start introducing any kind of substances, or once we start messing with the balance, really quickly everything just kind of gets thrown out of whack. But anytime something like this happens, we end up with a non-standard unit. The other problem we can have is that all three of them do not sort of cycle through to completion. If you think back to the standard behavioral index in the scale of post-intelligent impulse, you can lose the capacity for compression, and you can lose the capacity for subtraction. And in an environmental sense, that sort of problem can persist. And from there, you try to make these new cycles of communication without these other components. And that can lead to a problem. That can lead to some issue when trying to recognize environmental information, or when trying to store information, or go through emergent kind of experiences. So it becomes very apparent very quickly how sensitive this entire system could be. If anything happens, if you miss out on one of these, if you alter these, or for some reason they change, all of a sudden everything is just abnormal, it's all weird. So what we assume in the non-standard behavioral index is that the processes that are happening are going to be based on some abnormality. And the further you get in, the easier it is to blame it on something else. From the components of impulse, these are what's going on. But even if some of the experiences you have are normal and some of them are abnormal, the result of that is going to be best seen in the specific process or specific characteristic. So we may not always be able to blame it on this once we get to other aspects of the index, but from a purely impulsive sense, from a purely environmental standpoint, and becoming familiar with the environment and so forth, we can always blame it on one of these components. And if one of them is wrong, we have to figure out what we can do to fix them. But it's very difficult to try to intervene in that because it can make something worse, it could lead to some other problem, and so forth. But anytime that these are altered, you end up with what you consider a non-standard cycle of communication, and that's what allows us to look at what happens in other places in the index when something non-standard happens. So from the Z0 scale, we can move into the R scale, and the only thing we'll have to do is look at each specific characteristic and talk about what happens when a non-standard process occurs. So to continue, when we talked about the standard behavioral index, we talked about all the things that are required to get to the faculty of intelligence. And once we get all those things, the normal faculty of intelligence is taking a standard unit and reactivating it, taking another standard unit, reactivating it, and then making a connection between those things. So instead of starting right at the bottom and working our way up, we're going to start at our limits and work our way down. And one limit that is kind of easy to begin with is going to be at the intimate limit, or kind of where the goal of communication is. And that is the sixth characteristic of communication. And in the standard sense, the sixth characteristic is called intimate orientation. That's where you get your kind of maximum understanding. That's where you kind of have that overwhelming kind of overload event. And then from there, you're supposed to reciprocate that with somebody else. But once you get to that point and something happens and you don't back away, you start dealing with the abnormal stuff. Once you start going against what is naturally supposed to happen, you start dealing with abnormal. So there are a few things that can happen at the sixth characteristic. One of them is that you continually try to communicate in order to get that release to happen. You keep trying to bring more information up, you keep trying to say something, you keep trying to communicate a problem that's happening, and that's referred to as reversion. And that's kind of where you get stuck in a loop. Excuse me, that's recursion with a C. Reversion is also part of this, but recursion with a C is what happens when you get stuck in a loop. Recursion. And that's where you continually try to provide information to get your point across when there is no overload happening, there is no reciprocation going on, and you just kind of keep going with it. That's called recursion. The other thing that can happen is something called reversion, and that's what's supposed to happen. You're supposed to step away from that process of intimacy, and you're supposed to sort of revert back to a lower status of activation. So those are sort of the primary problems that you get at the sixth characteristic of communication, and that's sort of what you refer to in terms of those processes, either recursion, where at the sixth characteristic you're trying to force that process to happen, or reversion, meaning that you kind of step away from that process. So those are like the non-standard ways to talk about what happens at the sixth characteristic of communication. And it may be easier to recognize that because it's much more likely that people are going to run into that problem. It's built into getting to that dynamic and backing back out of it. So if you continue in the opposite direction, kind of in reversion, you get to the fifth characteristic of communication. And there are two primary processes there. One of them is reversion, and that's what's supposed to happen. You're supposed to kind of continue away from that dynamic. And the other two things you see are deceit. And that's sort of a coping mechanism that you use to change your attention, to change the attention or the focus of the conversation from that dynamic to any other thing. And deceit doesn't have to be harmful necessarily. It doesn't necessarily need to be just flat out trying to lie to hurt somebody. It could just be as simple as, offering false information or something that's obviously not true, and sort of forcing people to read between the lines and so on. And the other problem that you can have at the fifth characteristic is a deferral. And a deferral is just ignoring the cycle of that dynamic of intimacy. It's just kind of ignoring whatever somebody else is saying. So maybe somebody else is trying to deceive you, you just ignore what they're saying. Maybe they're going through the process of recursion, you just ignore them, and you kind of just leave it there. And from there, hopefully you can get away from that dynamic in order to facilitate something else that is more constructive. But those are primary things that you expect to see there. And then the fourth characteristic, which is normally intimate interaction, you deal with also reversion and also a deferral. But you can also deal with a process that I don't really have a better term for than anxiety. And anxiety deals with wondering whether or not that foundation for communication is there. I don't really have a better term to use for it, but that's essentially what you're doing. You're unsure if that process of being able to communicate at that level is actually achievable by both people. And that sort of being unsure and trying to figure out one way or the other is sort of the term that standard theory relates to anxiety. There is more severe versions of it, but that's something that is part of how standard theory organizes severity of a problem. But these are essentially some of the things that can happen when it just comes to the non-standard processes, and not necessarily the disease that goes along with them. But these are sort of what you can observe at these different characteristics. So the sixth characteristic is normally intimate orientation, where you have the overload event and then you try to make meaning of it, and that's sort of the dynamic between the fifth and sixth characteristic. The fifth characteristic is normally, in the standard sense, going to be your intimate identity, where you determine one way or the other what the outcome of the overload is. And then the fourth characteristic, which is normally the intimate interaction, is how you determine if you have the appropriate foundation to facilitate that dynamic. So you see recursion, you see reversion, you see deceit, deferral, and then some anxiety happening. So if you notice the pattern between these, you essentially see that most of these are just moving away from the whole dynamic of intimacy. It's moving away from the whole process of communicating that information and going through your overload and all that stuff. And this is essentially what you can see in the non-standard sense in intimate communication. This is how people display non-standard characteristics in intimate communication, but we can also look at silent communication and the other communication types as well. So to begin in silent communication, we'll start with the third characteristic. And in the normal sense, the third characteristic is silent orientation. So what you get when you have to deal with the issue of understanding whether or not your body status is where it needs to be and so on, and understanding where you can direct your energy and so forth, and having that free will. What you tend to see here is something called compensatory behavior. And that's the point where you have to decide between your body status and just openly communicating with someone. And for whatever reason, if your body status has not allowed you to choose where to focus your energy, you have no choice but to use your body to determine what the next thing is. All that stimulation that you're trying to bring up and all that stuff is going to be limited. And that's going to lead to body language. That's going to lead to the sort of behaviors that you think of that are like pathologic or unsatisfactory. So at that level, you're just dealing with some amount of lack of orientation. You know, that disorientation is what's going to lead you to deal with that type of behavior. So anytime that you see that problem, someone's saying one thing but they're behaving in a different way, you can sort of refer to that abnormal behavior as compensatory. You're trying to compensate for the amount of energy that you're needing to expend to communicate something directly to someone, but since that energy is not available, you have to do something to get that additional stimulation, and that is something in silent communication that displays itself as body language. You can also think of it as like disorientation and other kinds of things like that. The original, the standard version of the third characteristic is silent orientation. You can also think of it as a disorientation. But that leads to a change in behavior that leads into the perceived need for additional stimulation. And instead of being able to communicate or talk or say what's going on, you have to use some kind of body language to explain that. And the general term for that is compensatory behavior. So if you move even further from that, you go to the second characteristic. And this is a very general term, but it's referred to as intimacy dysfunction. And this is an extremely important barrier when it comes to understanding the non-standard sort of set of characteristics. Intimacy dysfunction is essentially a physical barrier. It's related to neurochemistry. It's related to the amount of energy available for the body. It's related to how tired you are. It's related to stress. And when we described the second characteristic of communication, the focus was on satisfying your inhibitions. It was taking all the inhibitory neurochemistry and satisfying it through things like resting and eating and sleeping and exercise. But in intimacy dysfunction, the problem is that you need to communicate something. You need to get something across to somebody, but your body will not let you. Your body and your mind are locked in a battle for those resources, and it prevents you from doing anything beyond your own self-interaction. It keeps you from doing anything beyond your body language and your behavior. It prevents you from doing that. And it's an enormous barrier. And it's very difficult to get through because it's a very individual problem. It's a silent issue. So intimacy dysfunction prevents you from getting any further into the R scale. It's literally an enormous barrier. It's an enormous hurdle. And if you think about neurochemistry, there are about a dozen or so inhibitory chemicals that will prevent you from overcoming that, whereas you only get one or two excitatory chemicals to overcome that. So it's very difficult to do. You're several times more likely to experience intimacy dysfunction at some point than you are any of the standard stuff. And this problem right here, the second characteristic in the non-standard, is a huge, enormous problem. It's really worth looking into, especially when we get to like the diagnostics and why people behave the way they do. It's because they don't have an option. They don't have a way to get to what they're trying to express to someone, and that leads to an enormous set of problems. It changes the way that this becomes transmuted into the Z scale, and it changes the way that people deal with those different ranges on the Z scale, and it could potentially affect how well you're able to get back into the Z naught scale. So it causes a huge problem, and most of that is related to body status. It's mostly related to how rested you are and then the tendencies that arise based on that. So if you're constantly dealing with some form of intimacy dysfunction, that just becomes the way you cope with things. That becomes your coping mechanism and how you deal with them. And when somebody else tries to get you out of that or tries to change it, it becomes an enormous train wreck. It's terrible, but it's a really, really prominent part of getting to experience the entirety of the R scale. Because if you think about going from the lowest to highest, that's as far as you get to go. So you're experiencing this, but you're missing out on everything else. And if you do experience all that stuff, you're still going to be limited, which is something that is just a consequence of that. But this is an enormous problem that people have, and it's very difficult to deal with, and it causes all kinds of problems. So that's worth noting, is how important intimacy dysfunction is. It's a very general term, but it's caused by all kinds of different body status changes. But just to continue on, there's also the first characteristic. And in a standard sense, the first characteristic is self-identification. And this is going to give us the sort of definition of what the non-standard version of the R scale is and why all these non-standard things happen. And there are two primary things that happen here. The first one is dissociation. I hope I spelled this correctly. I'm not sure I spelled that correctly, but dissociation. And dissociation is the process where you have some ideas connected and you disconnect those ideas. Now all of a sudden they don't mean anything anymore. You kind of just remove the process that creates that characteristic. You just stop doing that. Even if there's something that you normally would consider to be meaningful, you kind of just run out of energy and you have to kind of let go. And that's the process of dissociation. The other thing that can happen is depersonalization. So depersonalization is not only removing the meaning between those things, but also removing the meaning of the memory that you would have of something. So you can do either one of those. You can get back to where you just have a single idea, or even if you have two ideas and you've previously made meaning of those, you kind of remove that meaning. And the whole process of dissociation is to stop making meaning of your own internal experience. And you can do that willingly. It doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. That's something that describes why there's an aversive party in orthogonal thinking in the Nonstandard Behavioral Index and why there's a subversive party. But whoever dissociates can do that on willingly. And for that reason, they choose to go to social communication. They choose to go to orthogonal or orthogonal thinking or absolute thinking. But they do that by preventing additional meaningfulness being made in self-identification. So the whole process of self-identification is taking a standard unit and taking another standard unit and then making a connection between them. In the non-standard version of this, if we're dealing with non-standard problems from the Z0 scale, the thing that we're going to deal with is some weird thing. We're going to deal with a square, and then we're going to have like a weird star, and then we're going to try to make a connection between those. And if you have the original ones, that's going to equal a ratio of about 3 units. And if you have these abnormal things, it's going to be any other ratio. It could be 2.5, it could be 1.5, it could be 4.5, it could be 7, it could be whatever. And anytime we do that, the problem that we're going to get as we move along are different amounts of information with each unit. So if we normally have 3 units here, we do it again, we have 3 units here, we do it again, we have 3 units here. That's going to give us our congruent sort of standardization. But if one of these only has 2 units, and then one has 3 units, and one has like 7 units, we're going to get there maybe, but in a different way. And that's what makes some of these other things so difficult to do. That's the reason that the process of intimacy dysfunction becomes associated with all these abnormal behaviors. And the same with compensatory behavior. We can't really tell whether or not we have enough energy to communicate that stuff. And we can't really tell if we can focus on ourselves versus something else. So that's the other problem that we get, along with dissociation, depersonalization, is combining irregular units. And that keeps us from resolving one characteristic to the next. It sort of makes it hard to see which set of information goes along with the next. And doing that is all of these sort of irregular processes that can arise from it. So anytime you think of the non-standard behavioral index, it's also very simple to just think of there being some kind of unit that is non-standard being combined rather than the standard unit of compression being combined. But that essentially gives us the non-standard version of intimate communication, and then here we have a non-standard version of silent communication. So the next one to look at is the non-standard version of social communication. So to start with social communication, we'll have the ninth characteristic. And normally the ninth characteristic is what you consider to be the social identity. And that's where you separate yourself from your individuality, and that's where you consider all the stuff that you understand, you know about the world. But in the non-standard sense, what you deal with is something called social identity disorder. And I'll go ahead and sort of point out a trend. Whenever we thought about the non-standard version of intimate communication, we were moving away from the dynamic of intimacy, of communicating that information. When you get to silent communication, we're trying to figure out how much we can commit to communicating, and we're trying to figure out things about our body status, about what we're making meaning of, and whether or not we can direct our choices towards one or the other. So there's a trend in social communication, the non-standard version as well, and that trend is tied into the that trend of social communication is tied into intimate and silent communication. And what happens in an abnormal sense in social communication is replacing whatever is going on intimately, or whatever is supposed to be going on intimately, or in a silent sense, with whatever's happening in the environment. It's sort of like swapping and confusing the two. So social identity disorder is related to using your social status, your title, your position, or your part of a group or something like that, using that to facilitate one of the other non-standard processes. You're saying, I'm not going to talk to you because I'm so-and-so. You're saying that whatever you're thinking has nothing to do with me because I'm so-and-so. Or I'm part of this group, so your whatever you're trying to communicate to me has a different meaning, or something like that. So essentially what you're doing is replacing who you are in a social sense, or the group that you're in, or the type of position you hold, using that as an excuse not to continue with intimacy. And that's kind of the way it should be, but instead of going through reversion, or instead of trying to find some other way to tell them, you're forcing that into the communication. So social identity disorder is how you use who you are in a group, or your position, or your title, to replace one of the other communication types. And to continue that trend, we can look at the eighth characteristic. And the eighth characteristic is very similar. You're using some external thing to replace communication, but with the eighth characteristic, you're using an item. You're not using your who you are or your participation or whatever. You're using an item to do that, and that's referred to as addiction. And when you rely on that item to communicate with people, and you rely on the object, or you rely on its presence or its position, or whether it's there or not, or how it's maybe it's turned on its side rather than standing up. If you use that to try to convey something to somebody else, that's a form of addiction. And the way that people think of addiction is using substances and stuff, and that brings up the argument that lots of addiction is using those things so that you can communicate with people, so that you can re-experience that state of mind, so that you can convey what you're going through to somebody else. It's just that it's very difficult to do without the utilization of that item. And it doesn't have to be substances. It could be cards, it could be figurines, it could be gambling, it could be some other behavior. But what you're doing is replacing what would normally be a one-on-one communication or a self-communication or what have you with that item. And that's referred to as addiction. So that's where you rely on the social orientation to replace your communication for you. Similarly, the same way that you think of your social identity is replacing a communication for you. To continue, there's also the seventh characteristic of communication. And it's also a way to replace the normal aspects of intimate communication and silent communication, but it's done through an interpretation. So that process is called social intimacy. And it works in two ways. There's sort of the aspect of social intimacy that's related to recursion, where you continually try to get your interpretation of what's going on to influence the people around you. You keep trying to make meaning out of the social situation so that other people around you can change their idea or their meaning of what's happening. And alternately, you can see that somebody recognizes something in the social environment. You can see that somebody else is making meaning of something, and you can try to associate that with your own dynamic of intimacy. So it kind of works both ways. It's kind of observing what's going on in the environment and trying to experience intimacy through that. And it's also trying to use your own experience of intimacy to influence a group of people. So if you think of the normal definition of intimacy, it's one person with exactly one other person, and that goes on until something gets in the way. With social intimacy, there's not necessarily any reciprocation. It's just out into the environment, or it's using what's in the environment to try to change something about your one-on-one interpretation of things. So that's the way that our normal dynamic of getting to that overload and interpreting it is being replaced by recognizing something in the environment and interacting with an environmental thing. So those kind of give us the associated phenomenon with each of those characteristics. So the ninth characteristic, which is normally social identity, if there's some problem with that, it leads to social identity disorder. The eighth characteristic, if there's something wrong with there, which is the eighth characteristic is normally social orientation, it leads to the process of addiction. And the seventh characteristic, which is normally social interaction, can lead to the problem of social intimacy. And once again, this enormous roadblock right here of intimacy dysfunction can play a very significant role in the reasons why these characteristics don't resolve themselves in the standard way. It's an enormous problem as to why people go through these. It's not always the entire story, but it's prominent enough to mention that intimacy dysfunction has the potential to influence why people will prefer to use these or why they end up using these as a replacement for what would otherwise be considered normal intimacy or otherwise considered normal silent interaction. So with that, we've gone through the abnormal version of horizontal thinking. And within horizontal thinking, there's social communication, there's intimate communication, and silent communication. So if we just want to recap the whole thing, we can just look at all of the characteristics in horizontal thinking and define those. And from there, after that recap, we can continue on to the next thinking type. So in horizontal thinking, we have the three communication types in the non-standard version of the R scale. There's the intimate communication type, which is characteristic 6, 5, and 4. So the sixth characteristic, you see reversion and recursion. The fifth characteristic, you see reversion. You also see deceit and deferral. Then the fourth characteristic, you see what you consider to be anxiety. You also see deferral, and from there you move into the silent communication type. Silent communication, we have the third, second, and first characteristics. So the third characteristic you can consider to be compensatory behavior. And the second characteristic is going to be intimacy dysfunction. And then the first characteristic is going to be dissociation or depersonalization. And finally, you have social communication, and those are characteristics 9, 8, and 7. So the ninth characteristic is social identity disorder in the non-standard sense. The eighth characteristic is going to be addiction, and the seventh characteristic is going to be social intimacy. So now that we have those defined, we can continue to see what happens when those non-standard things sort of bleed over into orthogonal thinking, and we can talk about the dynamic there. So moving on to the next thinking type, we have orthogonal thinking. And orthogonal thinking has one communication type, and that's shared communication. And if you remember in the Standard Behavioral Index, shared communication deals with a relationship between people. There's one person who considers something and kind of conveys that information, and the second person tries to fill in the gaps based on that information that they provide. And that's normally happening between two parties. That's the aversive party, who's the one that's providing the information, and then we have the subversive party, who's filling in the gaps within their own set of characteristics. So with horizontal thinking, the problem is in the individual characteristic. The problem happens when each one of those characteristics either isn't resolved or you kind of fail to achieve that level of activation. In orthogonal thinking, it's a little bit different, and the thing that becomes abnormal is the relationship between the aversive and subversive party. And the general term for the entire problem with orthogonal thinking is something called shared identity disorder. So both of these are related to shared identity disorder. And that dynamic can go wrong on either side of things. And you can think of them based on what happens when that relationship is facilitated. So there's aversive identity disorder, and the term that standard theory uses to address that is something called forced identity disorder. So in an aversive sense, the thing that's going on in a standard way is that a person is considering some social thing, and that's referred to as a social identity. They're bringing that about and communicating something about it. So that's referred to as normally their social identity, and that's denoted by a 9 characteristic. And normally you're going to add that to whatever the result of the subversive party's kind of relational interpretation is. But in forced identity disorder, the thing that's going to happen is that the aversive party is going to use whatever they want here. They can make something up, they can lie about it, they can tell them the wrong thing, but they're doing so in order to have the subversive party match whatever the aversive party wants them to believe. So they're forcing an identity onto the subversive party by withholding information, by giving them false information, by lying to them. They're doing something that's going to prevent them from taking a pure and true consideration about the information, a non-biased kind of approach to that. So that's sort of what forced identity disorder is. And when that happens, you may not have a 9 characteristic here. You may have 10 or 11 or 8 or 6 or 1. But whatever the true characteristic happens to be is being presented as though it's a 9 characteristic. So that becomes a problem later on when the subversive party tries to make sense of that, and all of a sudden there's other things involved, or there's something that they weren't told, or there's some mismatch between what the reality is and what the aversive party provided for them. So because the aversive party is trying to force what their beliefs are onto the subversive party, they're trying to influence what they're dealing with, that's referred to as forced identity disorder. And another term you can use is false identity disorder, but essentially referred to as just forced identity disorder. So that's essentially what can happen on the aversive side of things. You just kind of lie or mislead or withhold information to the other party. So on the other hand, the relationship can go wrong with the subversive party, and that leads to something called subversive identity disorder. And if you think of the dynamic that's happening here, the aversive party is providing some information, whether it be true or not, and the subversive party is waiting. They're using that relationship to determine their own individual understanding of something. And what happens in subversive identity disorder is that the subversive party will not act alone. They will not get into their silent communication. They will not get into self-communication. They will not decide without having an example of the aversive party there. They won't be able to make their own decisions. They won't be able to come to their own conclusions. And without having somebody to give them that example, they just kind of dissociate. They kind of just void themselves out. It becomes very difficult for them to handle whatever it is they're doing on an individual level. And that happens when you put the relationship as a priority over yourself. That's essentially what's going on with subversive identity disorder. That relationship becomes way more important than whatever your self-interaction is. It becomes way more important than whatever your intimate identity is. So whenever you put that relationship as top priority, it makes it very difficult to function and to make your own decisions without that. And those are essentially the two sides that you end up with, either someone providing false or wrong information from the aversive side, or the subversive side not really being able to function without the input of somebody else. And anytime that happens, you're going to end up with an abnormal amount of information. So, even if you normally would have 9 plus 7, whatever that would normally be, 16, if you actually try to remove something from that, there's a chance that it ends up being unresolved. If you do a normal decomposition from here, you're supposed to have a social interaction, but for whatever reason, the subversive party does not consider this as a social interaction. They're considering this as something like their silent identity, or they're considering something like this as their intimate identity. But for whatever reason, the influence of this characteristic does not match with whatever the subversive party is going through. And for that reason, you have to work the other way around. If you can recognize that they're going through something with their they're trying to apply this information to something about their self-interaction. So let's say the aversive party said that if you only sleep 30 minutes a night, you'll have 10 times more energy than if you were to sleep 8 hours. So for whatever reason, they try to only sleep 30 minutes a night, and now all of a sudden they're tired all day. But they believe whatever the aversive party said. So now these things don't match. So now if you just subtract what was supposed to be this time characteristic, you get 7 again, but they're trying to do something about how much they're sleeping, which is a self-interaction problem. So there's some disparity in the information that's happening. There's some mismatch that's there. And that's kind of how you can define the shared identity disorder. And that's sort of the result of having a forced identity put on you. And it's also a result of not being able to make decisions on your own. So that's essentially the consequence of what shared identity disorder leads to. And those are the two primary types, is the forced identity disorder and the subversive identity disorder. So if you think about the horizontal thinking type, everything is based on the individual characteristics. But when you think of the orthogonal thinking type, it's based on the relationship and how the priority is placed. And the result of that will also affect horizontal thinking, but the primary dynamic in orthogonal thinking is going to be the relationship between the two parties. And that's essentially the abnormal dynamic of shared communication.